When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart lurched, not from the fear of being caught, but from the certainty that he would see those messages. The ones I had meant to delete and never did. I reached to pull the phone from his hands, but he drew back with a quick, practiced motion and kept reading. I watched his face change line by line, watched the color drain and return like a tide, and felt my life tilt on its axis in a handful of seconds. Yes, he was going to learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled as he flicked to the next thread, and I knew, any moment now he would land on the one message that would shatter everything. The single line that explained far too much and yet left a deeper fog. My phone buzzed in his grip, a fresh notification blooming across the screen. I saw how his jaw tightened when he read the sender's name. He went still. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a childhood habit for when nerves pressed too hard from the inside. My nerves tangled with the heavy knowledge of what I had set in motion. His breathing quickened, I could hear it across the 2 meters between us, that small distance which felt like a ravine. This was exactly what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, the kind that quietly rewrites a life, and now. I didn't know how to move, how to speak, how to breathe, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so carefully to keep, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever carried a secret you did everything to hide, only to fail at the last moment when it mattered most? I used to think marriages didn't drift so much as they settled, like flour that eventually sinks to the bottom of a bowl no matter how you whisk it. We were fine by every measure that counts on paper. The rent was paid, the car serviced, appointments ticked off, birthdays remembered, a steady courtesy in our voices even when we were tired. But there was a quiet in our house that wasn't peace. It was the hush of a museum at closing time, air still, footsteps soft, every artifact in its place, no hands allowed. I slept beside my husband each night with the familiarity of a well-worn path, and woke each morning with a small ache just behind my ribs, a private punctuation I could never quite read. The invitation to the corporate celebration arrived folded in thirds, slid under my office door by someone in a hurry. I left it unopened for half a day, pretending I hadn't seen the embossed logo, the cheerful theme, the note about recognizing contributions. My job has always been about steady contributions. I am the person who remembers who needs a gluten-free option, who updates the spreadsheet everyone forgets exists, who stays late because someone must. That day I ate my lunch at my desk, opened the envelope with a letter opener sharper than necessary, and stared at the date. Friday, 7 o'clock. Black and white theme. Spouses welcome. I texted my husband that it wasn't mandatory. He texted back that he had a late call and would try to make it. That was our pattern, try to make it. The week leading up to the event was a braid of small errands. I dropped off a blouse at the dry cleaner, tried on a skirt that used to fit better, bought a lipstick in the improbable shade suggested by a patient saleswoman who assured me it was modern. I felt conspicuous in the mirror under the unforgiving light, studied the slope of my shoulders, the fine lines threading outward from my eyes like faint etchings. At home I laid out an outfit on the bed where the morning sun cut a bright rectangle across the quilt. There was a sensation I hadn't felt in years, not excitement exactly, but an alertness, as if a door had been cracked open in a room I'd assumed was sealed. On the day itself, I arrived early because I always arrive early. The hotel ballroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and cold air. Staff in crisp uniforms adjusted glassware with the precision of surgeons. I stood at the threshold longer than necessary, feeling the way the floor swayed beneath my heels, the way my chest rose and fell a little faster than usual. My purse vibrated, a message from my husband, running late. Don't wait for me. I put the phone away and threaded through the growing crowd, nodding at familiar faces, accepting compliments I didn't quite hear. He was there, new to the company, already the kind of presence that draws conversations into orbit. People laughed a little louder around him. He listened with a focus that made even small talk sound important. I noticed him the way you notice a window you hadn't realized could open. I did not plan anything. I reminded myself of all the reasons boundaries exist, because they hold the shape of your life in place when your hands are full and your attention is elsewhere. In that first hour we did not speak. I circled the room, exchanging pleasantries, steadying the tremor inside my chest by naming the objects around me: white tablecloths, black chairs, silver utensils, the mundane litany that helps you stay present. By the time the speeches began, the room had gathered its heat, that mingled warmth of bodies and ambition. I stood between two colleagues and clapped in the right places. Across the sea of heads I saw him angle away from a cluster of managers, as if he had slipped the current to find a slower stream along the edge. When he reached the far wall, he glanced up, and for a second our eyes met. I looked away first. It felt like an errant spark popping from a candle that had burned undisturbed for years. I took a turn about the lobby to breathe, moved past a mirror and recognized myself with a start. The lipstick really was modern. It made my mouth a precise line, a decision drawn in color. The corridor beyond the ballroom was cooler, air from a vent whispering along my collarbone. I walked without destination, letting my heart settle into a quieter rhythm. A woman from accounting passed me, shoes clicking briskly, her perfume a citrus note that faded fast. At the end of the hall a service door stood ajar. I could hear the backstage clatter of trays and ice. I thought of my husband, of the calls that ran late even when the clock said otherwise, of the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when taxes came due, of how he slept on his side facing away because it eased his shoulder. None of this was villainy. It was life, softened by repetition, dulled by daily obligations. Sometimes I wanted to tell him that I missed us, not because we were gone, but because we had become too dependable to notice. Instead, I collected the thought like a coin and slipped it back into the purse of my chest. The ballroom doors opened and a rush of music spilled out, a bass line that made the glass panes in the sconces tremble. I stepped back in, and a manager intercepted me with a quick congratulations for a project I'd kept afloat, the kind of praise that evaporates quickly but feels warm while it lasts. When he moved on, I turned and nearly collided with the new colleague. We both paused on that little misstep, the choreography of strangers. "Sorry," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. He smiled in a way that didn't require me to smile back. It would have been ordinary to end it there, to keep moving. I did keep moving. But I was aware of my own awareness, as if my body had leaned toward a sound only I could hear. I stood near the bar and ordered sparkling water. The bartender twisted a lemon peel above the glass and the spray caught the light. Around me, conversations layered: budgets, travel plans, a rumor about a departmental shuffle. I have always known how to stand inside a crowd and remain untouchable. Yet that night, fabric touched my wrist, a brush, not an invitation, and I turned. He had stepped close enough for me to catch a thread of his cologne, clean and faint, like linen dried in winter sun. "Congratulations," he said, because everyone had been told to congratulate everyone. I thanked him, and we both looked at the glass in my hand, that neutral object between two people who did not yet have a language for each other. I did not stay long in any one place after that. I drifted from table to table, made sure a junior colleague found her seat, took a call from a supplier in the hallway because the number had nagged me all day. When I returned, my husband had texted again, "I won't make it." "I'm sorry." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I typed "it's okay" and deleted it, typed "understood" and deleted that too, then sent a thumbs up I hated the moment it left my phone. That single, small icon, so efficient at making feelings irrelevant. When the formal part ended, the music loosened into something people could dance to, though few did. I watched shoes pivot and shoulders sway and told myself this was simply a night, one night among many. On my way to the coat check, I passed the new colleague talking with our director. He didn't see me. I was grateful for that. I signed my name on a little clipboard as if it mattered. Outside, the air had cooled. The doorman lifted a hand for a taxi I didn't take. Instead, I walked 2 blocks to the bus stop, heels unkind on the uneven pavement, city sounds settling into their late-hour arrangement. On the bus I sat by the window and let the silhouettes of buildings slide by, lights stacked like books on dark shelves. My reflection hovered in the glass, lipstick intact, hair pinned as planned, a woman who had done nothing she could not explain. And yet an aftertaste lingered at the back of my throat, a metallic hint of something about to happen. I pressed my palm to my chest and felt the steady thud there, my oldest metronome. A stop before home, I pulled the bell cord and stood early, bracing for the lurch. I walked the last stretch because the night asked for a few extra minutes. The house met me with its quiet. I hung my coat, set my shoes side by side, moved through rooms as if they were paragraphs I had written long ago and still remembered by heart. In the bathroom, I washed the lipstick from my mouth and watched the color bleed into the sink like a small, harmless wound. In bed, I lay on my back and counted my breaths to 20 and back again. When sleep came, it was thin. I dreamed of a hallway with too many doors and woke with the conviction that I had chosen none of them. Morning made the kitchen honest again, kettle hissing, toaster ejecting its predictable heat, the mail slot clacking. I poured tea and stood at the window while the neighbor's dog nosed the frost off the grass. My husband texted that he hoped it had gone well. I answered that it had. We were polite inside our distance. I dressed for work with careful hands, selecting a blouse that didn't feel like armor but wasn't soft enough to be mistaken for invitation. On the way to the bus, I adjusted my scarf and lifted my chin against the wind, a woman moving forward because forward was the only direction that made sense. At the office, the fluorescent lights did what they always do, flattened everything into usefulness. I set my bag down, turned on my monitor, checked the day's list. A knock sounded on the doorframe, the gentle kind that signals courtesy rather than need. I looked up. He was there, new to the company and already part of the map of my days, his shadow falling brief and straight across the threshold. "Welcome back," he said. It was an innocent phrase. It still is, if you set it down on paper and do not listen too closely to what your body remembers. I answered something ordinary, and he moved on. But the air in my office held the faintest shift, as if a window somewhere had unlatched itself in the night and a draft I couldn't locate was slowly changing the temperature by degrees too small to measure, and yet not small enough to ignore. The corridor outside the ballroom was cooler than the rest of the hotel, a narrow vein of quiet running beside the drum of the party. Music thudded through the wall like a heartbeat out of time, and the air conditioner traced a line of cold along my neck where my necklace didn't reach. I hadn't planned to be there. I had stepped out for a breath, a moment to reassemble the version of myself that smiled on cue and clapped at the right names. He arrived a few seconds after I did, not with purpose so much as with that same need to stand still. We looked at each other long enough to acknowledge that both of us had chosen the margin over the center. The laughter from the ballroom burst, then dulled again, as if a curtain swung and settled. We stood at a polite distance, two people who could still return to the room and to our separate lives with nothing unusual to explain. We didn't. We kissed. I have replayed that corridor 100 times since, its geometry so plain that there's nowhere to hide the reasons we stayed. The carpet was the kind every conference hotel buys, patterned to conceal stains, not to be noticed. The light was a little too white, flattening shadows and making faces honest. On the wall, a small framed map marked emergency exits in crisp red arrows. I remember thinking that it was the only straightforward promise in the building. I can't pretend I was carried by a swell of music or by fate or by any story I could use to forgive myself. I was carried by choice, a quiet one that sounded like a hinge turning. His hand was at my elbow for less than a second, not possessive, not pleading, just steadying. The kiss was brief, more punctuation than paragraph. When it ended, the air felt colder, and my face felt warmer, and I understood that nothing dramatic had happened and that everything had. I went back into the ballroom first. I found a conversation I could stand inside without participating, a circle where nodding counted as presence. I remember the taste of lemon from the water I poured immediately, as if citrus could wash intention away. He returned a few minutes later and directed his attention elsewhere with a precision that reassured and stung. If anyone noticed our absence at the same time, they didn't show it. That's one of the strange mercies of adult gatherings. Everyone is too busy maintaining their own equilibrium to audit yours. When I finally pulled my coat from the chair and left, my phone buzzed with another message from my husband, an apology for missing the speeches. He added that the call had gone well. I wrote that I was happy for him, and meant it in the way you mean it when you also want to be elsewhere. The morning after, I tried to put the kiss into a drawer labeled mistake and close it. Drawers like that never slide smoothly. At my desk, I rearranged my to-do list 3 times to keep my hands busy. I answered emails with a care that bordered on ritual. When the knock came on my doorframe, 3 polite taps that can only belong to a colleague who hasn't yet learned the informal shortcuts of an office, I told myself to breathe normally. He leaned on the threshold instead of entering, a line held. He mentioned a document he owed me. I said I would send him the template. Our exchange was simple because it had to be. After he left, I sat for a long moment with my palms flat on the desk, feeling the grain of the wood under my skin as if it could anchor me to the present tense. All day I noticed logistics. I noticed them the way you notice railings on a steep stair, grateful and also a little resentful that you need them. I noticed how he never stood too close in a hallway, how he never sent a message at a time that would suggest urgency, how in a meeting he addressed questions across the table rather than directly. I noticed my own habits, the way I kept my office door ajar just enough to be interruptible, the way I wore a cardigan I could clutch when the air conditioning ran too hard, as if holding fabric could keep me inside a line I meant to respect. These small choices carried the day, and then the day was gone, and I rode the bus home with the weight of my coat across my knees though the evening didn't require it. At home, I cooked a simple dinner, roasted vegetables and rice, and plated it with an attentiveness I reserve for days when I don't trust my thoughts to wander. My husband arrived later than usual, cheeks pinked by the cold, hair flattened by a cap he removed as soon as he shut the door. He apologized about the previous night in that efficient way we both use when there isn't time for more. He described the call, the glitch at the start, the solution they settled on, the relief. I listened and asked questions and set cutlery down without clatter. After we ate, he cleared the plates and I wiped the counters, a choreography neither of us needed to discuss. We watched a documentary about mountain towns. He fell asleep halfway through, head tilted, breathing soft. I watched the rest at a low volume, the narrator's voice threading through empty streets on screen. The house around us felt both safe and slightly out of focus, as if the lens had fogged and wouldn't quite clear. In bed I lay on my side and counted the sounds of the night, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car, a neighbor's balcony door sliding shut. I felt the pulse in my wrist, a small metronome that refuses to be argued with, and thought about the corridor again. I didn't think about it to dwell in romance. I thought about it because I needed to understand why I had stepped into that rectangle of light and done what I did. I catalogued reasons I could accept in the daylight, the accumulation of days too similar to each other, the hunger for a particular kind of attention, the way kindness can begin to feel like absence when it no longer includes touch. None of these felt like excuses. They felt like weather reports, conditions that explain but do not absolve. The next days unfolded in a pattern I can describe but not entirely defend. I kept my work steady. I kept my conversations neutral. I moved through corridors with my eyes on practical destinations, copier, kitchenette, conference room, and allowed my body to learn a new map that avoided unnecessary crossings. When crossings happened anyway, they were brief and unremarkable to any observer. He would lift a hand in greeting, I would nod, we would continue. If a colleague lingered near us, we included them, widened the circle to make sure no one could have reason to narrow it later. It was a slow dance of restraint, and I thought restraint would be our salvation. Restraint can be misread by the body as an invitation to fill the quiet with imagined outcomes. On Wednesday, he sent a calendar invite for a short working session about a report I maintain. It was prudent and public and harmless, precisely the kind of meeting people have every day without consequence. We sat in a small glass-walled room furnished with modest chairs and a table too shiny for its own good. He asked questions about columns and inputs. I explained the logic behind a formula that flags inconsistencies. We kept our eyes on the screen, on the numbers that do not blush, on the tidy rows that pretend reality is simple if you line it up just so. When the meeting ended, I closed my laptop and felt the familiar rush of relief that comes when you perform a task exactly as designed. On Thursday, the company circulated photos from the event, people mid-laugh, people holding small awards, people posed in front of the logo as if the brand could bless them. I clicked through because not clicking would have been conspicuous to myself. In one picture, I stood near the back, face turned slightly away, a glass of sparkling water in hand. He appeared in a different frame across the gallery, shoulders squared, tie slightly loosened, head tilted toward someone's joke. We were not pictured together. The absence comforted me and unsettled me in equal parts. I closed the email and put my phone face down. The weekend approached with the usual errands. I bought groceries, I vacuumed, I made a list of bills due and ticked them off with the pleasure of completion. On Saturday afternoon, I took a walk alone because the sky had that high, washed-out blue that makes even bare trees look elegant. I turned down a side street I rarely use and passed a cafe we sometimes order from. Inside, a woman stirred her tea with the deliberation of someone pacing herself through the afternoon. A man laughed without noise, mouth wide, eyes squeezed. I stood there longer than necessary, a spectator to a life that wasn't mine and never would be. Then I went home and folded laundry, socks into socks, towels into rectangles, a shirt of my husband's into a shape my hands know without thinking. The ache behind my ribs returned, manageable, constant, like weather settling in. If this chapter were a map, there would be a corridor marked with a small, bright X and a series of careful detours afterward. But maps leave out texture. They do not show the way the air felt different when I woke the next morning, lighter and heavier at once, or the way my body moved through familiar rooms with a new economy, conserving words, conserving gestures. They do not show the new dread that arrived with certain sounds, the ping of a message, the knock on a door. They do not show the private approvals, how good it felt, briefly, to be seen by someone who had not already memorized me. I carried all of this quietly, like a glass of water filled to the brim, one careful step at a time. By Sunday night, the corridor had been catalogued and filed and could still knock against me like a drawer left slightly open in the dark. I stood at the bathroom sink and washed my face and thought about the week ahead. Work would want what it always wants, deliverables on time, no surprises. My husband would want what he'd learned to need, reliability, warmth that didn't require translation. My body would want something I could not yet name out loud, perhaps not even to myself. I dried my face and met my reflection and saw a woman who could still choose differently. I turned off the light and walked to the bedroom, counting my steps in the dark, each number a small promise to do better and the faint suspicion that promises, like corridors, can hold more than one outcome if you stand inside them long enough. The elevator doors were already closing when I stepped in, a reflexive reach that slid my hand between polished steel and a pane of mirrored glass. For a beat the doors pressed against my palm, then reversed with a soft bell as if the building itself had taken pity on me. He was inside, alone, facing the panel where the buttons glowed in a tidy column. We both shifted, the choreography of two people making room in a box that refuses to be bigger. The cables thrummed in the shaft. Somewhere above us a fan clicked to life. He lifted a hand a fraction and then let it fall. "Ground?" he asked, and I nodded. The doors sealed, the floor trembled, numbers climbed with professional indifference. I watched our reflections stand at polite angles, the space between us measured not in inches but in decisions we were trying not to remember. When the doors opened, a colleague was waiting with a stack of folders. We stepped aside in synchronized courtesy, and in that careful moment the day began again, officially, as if the night at the hotel were an entry misfiled and now corrected. I tell myself I value routines because they keep the lights on. That morning I clung to them the way a swimmer clings to a lane line. Coffee in the break room, calendar scan, a short meeting where I reported on numbers the way a weather forecaster reports on temperatures no one can change. My inbox produced its ordinary mix of urgencies and illusions. At 10:30 an internal message arrived from him with a subject line so neutral it might have been designed by a committee, report alignment. He suggested a quick review off-site to avoid the constant interruptions in our open-plan floor, an argument I could not dispute without revealing more than I meant to. The cafe 2 blocks away had reliable Wi-Fi and bad chairs. We chose it because everyone chose it when they wanted to work but not be seen working. I typed OK and added a time. I watched the message leave my screen like a paper boat set adrift in a narrow canal where the current is slow and the banks are close. Before I left, I opened my bottom drawer and considered the cardigan folded there, the gray one that softens the line of my shoulders. I put it on. It was an old habit, armor disguised as kindness to myself. Outside, the wind herded small leaves down the sidewalk, a procession of tiny flags in no particular order. The cafe door stuck like always, a resistant hinge that required a confident tug. Inside, the air smelled of bitter beans and something sweet baking behind the counter. He was already there, not at our usual corner but at a table near the back where the light was even and the sightlines were practical. He had a notebook open and a pen aligned with its spine. The laptop was off, as if he too were trying to manage the temperature of our meeting by lowering the wattage of devices. We began with numbers because numbers are legal to touch. I pointed to columns that misbehaved. He traced gaps where our team's inputs failed to reconcile. I used my careful voice, the one that separates error from blame. Our words lived on the surface of the table between us, a kind of neutral territory where facts could be placed without heat. He listened in a way that made the room narrow to the square we occupied. I noted that listening, filed it in a place of the mind that does not have a label. When the first pass was done, he asked for context on a policy change from last year. I explained the history, how the draft had stumbled through 3 revisions, how a manager had left and someone else had inherited a decision at an awkward hour. My hands made shapes in the air, his pen made small dashes in the notebook, like ticks on a fence post. Halfway through, I became aware of the door chiming open and of the low friction of coats and scarves arriving in pairs. The city's lunch hour has a rhythm, this one was beginning to swell. A woman from our floor walked in with 2 teammates. They scanned the room in that quick, bird-like way people do when they're searching for empty seats and a story at once. For a second, her gaze swept across us. I lowered my eyes to the screen. He shifted the laptop closer and angled it, a motion with several meanings, none of them dramatic. I said something about the audit trail because I needed a sentence with more syllables than my pulse. The 3 of them took a table near the window. We were in their peripheral vision now, not center stage, not invisible, just ordinary or something close enough to it that I could work with the resemblance. I don't remember all the words we used to keep our footing after that. I remember the texture of the moment, the scrape of a chair leg 2 tables over, the barista calling a name that wasn't mine, the flake of croissant that stuck to my sleeve until I brushed it away. He asked how long I'd been maintaining the report. I answered in months, not years, to keep the number small. He made a dry joke about the romance of spreadsheets, so quiet it landed like a note only two instruments could hear. I did not laugh. I chose a phrase about sustainability instead, the kind of term that sounds responsible and calm. He took the cue and returned us to what we were there to do. If anyone glanced up, they would have seen what we wanted to be seen, two colleagues reconciling a process because work, like gravity, insists. When we closed our laptops, the relief came not as a rush but as a settling. We stood almost at the same time, making sure no sleeve brushed, no bag strap tangled. I let him reach the door first. He pulled it open and held it, not for me particularly, but for whoever was next, which happened to be me. The cold air pressed its palm to my face. Outside, the sidewalk was a stream of errands. He said he would update his team and send me the revised schedule. I said I would flag any anomalies that surfaced in the next upload. The exchange took 6 sentences and none of them were a promise we couldn't keep. Then we walked back toward the office, not side by side but separated by a pedestrian or two, our pace moderated by the crosswalk lights that blink at the same tempo every weekday. Back inside the building, the day resumed the shape it always takes when you've stepped away and returned with nothing to declare. I sent a note to a manager about a budget line that needed adjustment. I refiled an invoice that had migrated into the wrong folder. I answered a supplier's question about lead times with the tone of a person who expects systems to behave if you remind them of their obligations. At 3, I took a call from a junior colleague who had lost a password and, with it, her composure. I talked her through the reset and listened to the unasked question under her thanks. Will I always feel this uncertain? I said what I say to myself on worse days, not always, and not alone. Dusk tilted the windows violet by the time I gathered my things. I prefer to leave before the lights go fully artificial. It helps the day end in a color I recognize. The bus arrived with its usual sigh. I took a seat near the back and let the city's faces blur into types. The student, the nurse, the courier, the man with the tired briefcase that looks like my husband's. Home was the same address and the same key turning the same lock. The kitchen had kept its afternoon cool. I turned on the oven and found a pan by touch. I cooked without checking a recipe. The counter collected small gestures, a lemon half, a pinch of salt, a folded dish towel. When my husband came in, he rubbed his hands together to bring back the feeling and smiled with the outer half of his mouth. He told me about a rescheduled meeting. I told him about a printer that had finally been serviced. These are the sentences that hold up a house, not because they're grand, but because they arrive when they should. After dinner we sorted the mail. I shredded an offer we didn't need and filed a reminder for the dentist next month. He checked the thermostat, a ritual he trusts the way some people trust prayers. Later, we watched the news until the anchor's voice softened into reassurance. In the pause between segments he asked if the event had been fun. I told him it had been adequate, and he squeezed my shoulder in the affectionate way people do when they don't want to press. He went to bed early with a book he's been reading in small portions, the kind of book that doesn't punish you for putting it down. I washed 2 glasses and set them upside down on a linen towel to dry, listening to the tiny sound of water breaking its surface tension and letting go. I thought that would be the end of the day, but near 11 my phone buzzed with a calendar update. He had sent the revised schedule, thorough and tidy, each milestone a box that could be checked at the right time. Thanks, I wrote, and then decided not to send it because thanks can sometimes be read as a reopening. Instead, I archived the thread so it would require intention to find again. I sat in the dark living room for a while, the screen light cooling my hands. Outside, someone's laughter rose and fell and was gone. I made myself a rule I could live with: no unnecessary meetings, no messages after work, no lingering in doorways. The rule felt useful and also late. Sleep, when it came, was a series of small rooms I moved through without turning on lights. I woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the house breathe. Morning settled on the windows. In the bathroom mirror I was unmistakably myself, the same lines at the corners of my eyes that mark the years I have lived and the times I've smiled. I chose a dress that reads as competent rather than charming. On the bus I stood the whole way because the crowd pressed close and because standing helped me feel the ground under the vehicle. At work, the day greeted me with a list. The first item I crossed off was simple: update the index page that links all the quarterly reports, a task so straightforward it felt medicinal. Mid-morning, I passed him in the hallway outside the conference rooms. We both slowed and then didn't. A manager rounded the corner and stopped us with a question about deadlines. We gave the same answer at the same time, a small chorus that made the manager smile. It was almost comic, as if the building had cast us as a duet and we had learned to sing our parts without looking at each other. By afternoon, the woman from the cafe had stopped by my office to drop off a flyer for a volunteer day. She stood in the doorway, cheerful and harried, telling me how they needed hands for sorting donations, how last year the turnout had been modest but spirited. I said I would check my calendar. She glanced at the photo on my shelf, one from a trip my husband and I took years ago to a coast where the rocks looked like old knuckles. That was a good weekend, I said, and realized I'd said it aloud. She smiled and said she hoped I'd have another soon. After she left, I held the flyer a moment longer than necessary and then tucked it into my planner where I keep things I am not ready to decide about. As the day thinned, a sharp light cut through the high windows, the kind of late sun that exaggerates dust and edges. I shut down my computer, slid the chair in, and stood for a second in the doorway of my office, framing the view the way you frame a photograph you never take. In the corridor, footsteps echoed at intervals, each pair its own story, none of which belonged to me. I walked toward the elevators with the measured pace of someone trying not to race ahead of herself. When the car arrived, it was full, a small democracy of coats and bags and faces leaning into the evening. I found a place near the buttons, kept my eyes on the lit numbers, and let the building carry me down. Rain claimed the city in a single, decisive sweep, the kind that flattens plans and turns sidewalks into thin rivers. I was at the curb with a paper folder held over my hair and a bag that was not meant for weather, counting the seconds between passing buses that were already full. The first thunder was distant but persuasive. People around me performed their small triage, jackets shrugged up, scarves over heads, a woman stepping back under a shallow awning that offered more hope than shelter. I could have waited it out. I could have gone back inside. I didn't, because sometimes forward is less a choice than a slope. The umbrella appeared at the edge of my sightline, black and compact, held at a height that made room without making an announcement. I didn't need to look to know who stood beside me. The rain drummed on the fabric with the focused insistence of a metronome. We angled toward each other just enough to fit inside the circle of dryness, and the move had all the choreography of an office courtesy, door held, elevator button pressed, except for the quiet calculation of shoulders and wrists. Water was already creeping into my shoes, a cold that declared itself inch by inch. A taxi slowed, then reconsidered us and surged on. Across the street, a bus blinked its lights and surrendered to another stop. He tilted the umbrella to keep a gust from cutting under it. The motion brought the scent of wet wool and street into the small air we shared. We stepped off the curb at the same time, scanning for gaps between tires and puddles. A car sent a sheet of water toward us and we turned in mirror image, two halves of a reflex. I felt absurdly grateful for the umbrella, for the simple physics of a circle that made sense. The rain eased just enough for us to reach the corner where the overhang above the deli gave a better margin. He closed the umbrella with a practiced snap that flung the last drops away and held it gripped down at his side. "You okay?" he asked, but the question lived mostly in the tilt of his head. Fine, I said, and it was even true if fine meant wet toes, racing heart, and the sense that the day had found a way to keep me from forgetting. Inside the building again, the lobby was a steam bath of damp coats. Elevators arrived and swallowed clusters. We waited for the next car without standing together, and by the time the doors opened we had returned to the safe arithmetic of adjacency. On my floor, the carpet wicked rained from our shoes and made a dark geometry that would fade by afternoon. I hung my cardigan on the back of my chair and touched my hair with the flat of my palm to smooth what the weather had lifted. The folder, miraculous in its pedestrian loyalty, had kept its contents dry. The rain had rearranged the office into small islands, people stayed where they were, meetings migrated to video, the hum of the building dropped a register. A manager sent a note moving our afternoon check-in to tomorrow. I was relieved in that way relief feels when it arrives with a chaperone called disappointment. Both emotions took a seat and behaved themselves. I turned to useful things, reconciled a set of numbers that had been slightly off for a week, drafted an email to a supplier and redrafted it to remove a sentence that sounded like impatience, updated a chart that no one but me seemed to notice mattered. By mid-afternoon the storm broke into a drizzle but pretended to be gentle while continuing to soak everything. I made tea, not because I needed it but because it gave my hands a task that wasn't typing. In the kitchenette I ran into the woman from the cafe. She shook her umbrella at the sink with an apologetic air, sent me a conspiratorial glance that said, "We're all caught out together, aren't we?" I smiled and said something about forecasts, the safe kind of conversation that acknowledges weather so we don't have to acknowledge anything else. He passed the kitchenette door, paused when he saw me, and lifted his mug in salute. "Printer's fixed," he said, "a piece of news small enough to be true and public enough to be harmless." "Good," I answered, adding, "it was starting to sound like a lawnmower, because jokes about office machinery build bridges no one falls from." He laughed, the briefest ribbon of sound, and continued down the hall. I stood there with the kettle steam rising along my cheek and felt the day settle again, the way a shaken snow globe returns its flakes to the ground one by one. At home that evening, rain beat a different rhythm against our windows, softer now, as if the city had remembered to be kind. My husband arrived on time, shoulders damp, hair flattened in a way that made him look suddenly younger. He set his keys in the dish by the door and rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Roads were a mess," he said. "Looks like it," I replied, passing him a towel I had warmed on the radiator, a small indulgence I sometimes remember. He smiled with the surprise of comfort and pressed the towel to his face. We made dinner together without commentary, moving around each other in the kitchen with the ease that comes from years of not colliding. He told me about a client who kept shifting requirements. I told him about the budget line that finally lined up after a week of refusing. When the plates were stacked in the sink, he leaned against the counter and looked at me longer than usual. Not suspiciously, just with that searching glance he used to give me when we were deciding whether to go out or stay in, back when our decisions were small and felt large. "You've been quiet," he said, a fact more than an accusation. "Long day," I answered, which was true as far as it went. He nodded. We let the quiet stay between us, shared property neither of us wanted to subdivide. Later, we sat on the sofa and watched a program we'd started the previous week, a series about architects who rescue strange buildings. He pointed out a detail in a staircase that I'd missed. I pointed out a roofline that didn't trust its own angles. It was good to talk about things that don't talk back. That night I woke before dawn and listened to the rain taper into a whisper. The house held its breath the way buildings do just before the heat clicks on. I thought of the umbrella again, of how something as simple as a circle of dryness can feel like a decision. Not a romance, nothing in my body tries to turn this into poetry, but a fact I couldn't file away. I pictured his hand closing the umbrella with that swift motion, the raindrops arcing away like tiny commas thrown into the air. I turned my face into the pillow and counted backward from a number that had no special meaning until sleep overtook me again. Morning brought the particular chaos of a city resetting after a storm. Sidewalks wore a residue of grit and flattened leaves. Traffic negotiated new potholes with old impatience. I left early to avoid the worst of it and still arrived with a damp halo at the hem of my coat. In the lobby, a maintenance cart stood sentry with a yellow sign that read wet floor, which felt less like a warning than a mission statement. On my desk the plant my colleague waters when I forget looked revived, as if it had been eavesdropping on the weather and approved. The day had the shape of preparation. We had a quarterly review approaching, the kind of meeting that invites everyone to show their spreadsheets as if they were photos of children. I built a clean narrative line through my data, knowing that numbers only persuade if they tell a story someone can repeat later without misplacing the verbs. I paused midday to stretch my hands and noticed an email in my personal inbox from a former neighbor, a cheerful update about her move, a photo of a new porch with a view of a light-dented river. I wrote back with genuine pleasure. It felt good to describe something that belonged to an earlier version of me, a street where I used to know the sound each trash bin made when it rolled. In the late afternoon, he sent a brief note, a link to a clean dataset, a single sentence confirming the change we'd discussed. I felt an unreasonable surge of gratitude for the restraint of it. No exclamation points, no lingering question that might require an answer at 11 p.m., no small talk that could be misread. I replied with precisely the information the work needed and left it at that. It was how I wanted the days to go, on time, contained, breathable. But weather is not the only thing that changes a city's mood. At 5:30, a building-wide fire drill announced itself with a siren that sliced through concentration. We filed out down the stairwell, shoes clanging slightly on metal steps, hands on railings, not because anyone was in danger but because ritual demands obedience to its script. Outside, people huddled in cluster codes, finance here, design there, while a marshal checked names against a list. He stood across the crowd, jacket unbuttoned, hands in pockets, mouth set in a line that kept a smile folded away. For a moment our eyes met over the top of a colleague's umbrella, a ridiculous relic on a dry evening. I looked away first. We all did what the drill wanted us to do, we waited, we recounted, we returned. That night at home, my husband and I ate late because he'd worked late. The food was simple again, eggs and toast and a salad that tasted better than the sum of its parts. He told me he was thinking of repainting the small room we never agreed on, his office, guest space, storage. A lighter color, he said, and his voice carried a question. Maybe, I said, and thought about how color changes a room's temperature even when the thermostat stays the same. He fetched paint chips from the drawer where home improvement dreams go to nap. We spread them under the lamp and held each one at different angles to see how the light tried to tell us the truth. I liked a pale gray with a hint of green, he liked a cautious beige that would never offend. We wrote the names on a scrap of paper and agreed to decide later, the oldest truce. Before bed, I sorted laundry while a message buzzed on my phone. It was from him, not a text, but an image shared through our work platform, a photo of a quiet corner in a book-lined lobby with two chairs angled toward each other, captioned only with the room name and a time. It was not an invitation, it was the kind of practical suggestion people make when they need to meet somewhere the noise won't interrupt a conversation about numbers. Still, the angle of the chairs suggested confidences. I stared at the image until it became just pixels. Then I typed a response that referenced the agenda and the document version, the kind of reply so unromantic it could cool a fever. He answered with a thumbs up, which I decided to treat as a receipt rather than a gesture. In bed, the rain had finally moved on and left the sky clean. The window was a dark square. My husband turned a page in his book and then another, the sound like a slow metronome, reliable, modest. I lay beside him and considered the paint chip we'd placed on the nightstand, our maybe gray, are cautious beige, small rectangles waiting for a decision that could be updated if wrong. I thought of the umbrella again, the radius of dryness that had felt like a room inside weather, and I told myself a rule that was less about virtue than survival. Tomorrow I will keep to rooms with doors that open to many people at once, to tables with more than 2 chairs, to corridors where the light is too white for misunderstanding. Rules, like umbrellas, only work if you hold them steady. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the room in the photo without the chairs at all, just a floor and walls and a door that stayed open. The message about the room lingered in my mind through the morning. It was the kind of space designed for side meetings, glass panels on 2 sides, shelves lined with books that were mostly for show, a muted rug to soften footsteps. The chairs in the picture had been angled deliberately toward each other, though anyone could claim they'd been arranged that way by chance. Our teams had a legitimate need to finalize figures for the next review, and the room was available for an hour in the late afternoon. There was no reason to refuse without inventing one, and I was tired of inventing. At 9, I confirmed the booking and wrote a short acknowledgement in the work platform, free of adjectives, as if restraint could be an anchor. The day between that confirmation and the meeting was a chain of routine tasks. I opened the shared document and combed through it line by line, matching each entry to its source. I recalculated subtotals that had shifted slightly with the latest updates, caught a discrepancy in a vendor code, and sent a quiet note to the department that owned it. My calendar filled with the usual interruptions, a brief check-in with a manager who liked to stand while talking, a call from procurement about a delivery delay, a reply-all thread that grew past usefulness before someone cut it off. Lunch was at my desk, a sandwich eaten in measured bites between adjusting cells in a spreadsheet. Outside, the weather held in a gray suspension, light diffused to the point of colorlessness. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered the files we'd need and printed a set of backup notes, not because I expected the network to fail but because paper has a solidity that screens don't. I reached the room a few minutes early and found it exactly as pictured, 2 chairs in the center, a low table between them, and the shelves framing the space like silent witnesses. I set my folder on the table and shifted 1 chair slightly so that they were not directly aligned. It was a subtle adjustment, but it allowed my body to angle toward the documents instead of toward him. He arrived with a tablet under one arm and a pen clipped to his shirt pocket. He greeted me with the same tone he would use with any colleague, and I returned it. We began by reviewing the updated totals, noting where department inputs had closed gaps or introduced new ones. He pointed to a figure that seemed too low. I traced it back to a line item that had been underreported and wrote a note to follow up. We moved through the list with an efficiency that felt deliberate, as if both of us had agreed silently to keep the work in the foreground. Every so often, the hum of the building filtered in, a door closing down the hall, the muted roll of a cart, voices fading past the glass. Halfway through, he handed me his tablet so I could scroll through a section while he checked another set of figures on paper. Our fingers brushed briefly, the kind of incidental contact that could happen with anyone, but it carried the weight of recognition. I kept my eyes on the screen, double-checking the formulas. The numbers resolved neatly once the missing entry was added, and I marked it for inclusion in the final draft. We didn't comment on the contact, just as we hadn't commented on the rain or the umbrella or the other small collisions the past weeks had held. Instead, we let the silence fold back around us and returned to the list. As the hour wound down, we consolidated our notes into a single action list. He suggested which items should be presented at the review as complete and which needed further explanation. I agreed with most, adjusted one, and added context for another. The final page was clean, a map from this meeting to the next. He saved the file and sent it to both our emails before closing his tablet. I slid my papers back into the folder and stood, feeling the slight stiffness in my legs from sitting too still. When we stepped out into the hallway, the late day light had shifted, catching the dust in the air in slow motion. We walked toward the elevators without speaking, matching each other's pace. At the corner where our paths split, his toward the south wing, mine toward the lobby, he paused just enough to say, "Good work today." I answered with a nod and the same words reversed. Then we moved in opposite directions, absorbed back into the rhythm of the building. The rest of the afternoon was a gentle slope toward evening. I answered 2 last emails, updated the shared drive with the new file, and tidied my desk so the morning would begin without clutter. Outside, the sky had taken on that winter blue that looks cold even from indoors. I caught the early bus and watched the city slide past, its lights coming on in no particular order. At home, the air smelled faintly of the soup my husband had started before leaving for a late meeting. I reheated it, added bread, and ate standing at the counter. The quiet was different from the office quiet, less watchful, more open, but it carried its own kind of awareness. Later, my husband called to say he'd be home past 10. I used the time to fold laundry and sort the mail. Among the envelopes was a postcard from a friend on vacation, the picture a beach I'd never seen, water so clear it looked unreal. I propped it on the kitchen shelf and thought about how some images exist entirely to be looked at, never lived. When he finally came in, the air on his coat was sharp with the night. We exchanged the shorthand of 2 people ending their days separately, remarks about traffic, a mention of tomorrow's weather, and then moved into the quiet of our shared space. In bed, I replayed the day without ornament. The room with the angled chairs. The brush of fingers. The list we built and the way it ended tidy, without spilling into anything else. I told myself that this was the right scale for what we had now, measured, contained, useful. A frame that kept the picture from shifting, even if the picture itself was more complicated than it appeared. Outside, the wind lifted once against the window and then was still. I closed my eyes, keeping the details where they belonged, in the archive of the day, recorded without comment, ready to be retrieved only if the work required it. The morning began with a rumor dressed as a question, the kind of office murmur that wears a smile to look harmless. By the coffee machine someone mentioned seeing me at the book-lined room yesterday, their tone neutral, their curiosity tidy. It could have been about any meeting. It could also have been about that one. I answered with the truth the calendar would corroborate, a working session to reconcile numbers before the review. The explanation held because it was accurate, and because accuracy is a shield if you hold it steady. Still, the remark stayed in the air, a fine dust that catches light even after you have wiped the surface clean. I buried myself in tasks, a deliberate descent into particulars. The new dataset needed checks. I wrote a small script to test edge cases and compared the output with last quarter's baseline. Spreadsheets behave when you give them boundaries, and for an hour the world narrowed to cells and sums and the satisfying logic of balance. Then my inbox tugged. A manager wanted slides, procurement needed dates, a colleague flagged a mismatch that turned out to be a typo with grand ambitions. I fixed it and sent a calm note that admitted the error without assigning guilt, then stood for a minute by the window, letting my eyes rest on the gray lift of the day. Near noon he messaged me a short question about a column header that refused to align. I answered with 3 words and a screenshot because brevity leaves little room for misunderstanding. He replied with a checked box and nothing else. The emptiness around those marks felt responsible, like an adult silence. I made tea, watched the string of the bag darken the water, and told myself to keep moving through the list. Work is not a cure, but it provides scaffolding when a wall feels suspect. The afternoon meeting with finance overflowed its allotted slot and relocated us to a borrowed conference room 3 floors down. Movement helped. The elevator was crowded with people from other departments, strangers whose lives intersected mine for 60 seconds and then vanished at the bell. The new room smelled faintly of dry markers and carpet cleaner. The chairs complained softly when pushed back. I presented the cleaned figures and fielded questions with the steadiness I've learned to manufacture. When someone asked about the variance in a line we had only just corrected, I explained the source calmly, showed the documentation, and watched the worry leave their shoulders like steam. Afterward, I chose the stairs for the climb back, counting landings as if they were beads. On the second floor landing, a maintenance worker had propped a door and was rolling paint toward a space marked for renovation. The color on the can matched one of the chips my husband and I had considered. I pictured the small room at home with its uncertain purpose and felt a tug of tenderness for the two of us standing under lamplight, holding rectangles of possible futures between our fingers. Back at my desk, a colleague forwarded photos from the corporate event. I scrolled without lingering. There I was near a table, posture correct, smile serviceable. There he was in a different frame, listening to someone with the attention that has become part of his silhouette. The camera never placed us together. The absence soothed and unsettled me at once, like a river that looks shallow until you step into its current. I closed the window and slid the phone face down. Evening threatened rain again, a low pressure that pressed thought into smaller shapes. I packed my bag by habit, notebook, charger, pen that writes without offense, the folder whose edges have learned the contour of my hand. In the lobby I crossed paths with him by the revolving doors. We both slowed, then matched speeds, then drifted apart like two leaves negotiating the same eddy. Outside, the bus exhaled warm air. I took a seat by the window and watched reflections overlay the street, inside faces on outside glass, a double exposure of what is seen and what is carried. At home the house had that late-day quiet that feels earned. I set my keys in the dish and wrote a quick list for groceries, adding paint tape almost without thinking. My husband texted that he would be home on time and asked if I wanted to try the gray. I answered that I did. The exchange was small and decent, a promise scaled to a life we could complete. I chopped vegetables with the attention I reserved for making nothing worse. The knife's rhythm steadied me, the pan answered with a quiet hiss. When he arrived we ate by the window because the sky was briefly the color of a bruise turning to cloud. We talked about the room as we washed dishes. He favored one wall at a time, argued for patience, for testing in squares before committing. I appreciated his caution while knowing that some decisions only become decisions when you let them be total. We dried the plates, set them upright, and compared schedules for the next day. He had an early call. I had the review. We wished each other an easy morning and meant it. Later, I opened my laptop to make sure the slides had exported cleanly. They had. I tested the clicker, because failure loves small technology. I laid out my blazer, chose a blouse without anything that could be mistaken for an invitation, and placed my badge beside the keys so morning would not grate. I charged my phone, filled a glass with water, and stood a moment by the bedroom door, listening to the soft shuffle of my husband turning pages. Sleep did not arrive when called. I lay on my back and let my mind walk the corridor of the day from coffee to kitchen to bed, naming each doorway and turning off each light. When thought circled back to the rumor at the coffee machine, I examined it without dramatizing. People notice patterns, people connect dots that do not belong together, people tell stories because stories explain nerves. I breathed in fours until my chest complied. Somewhere after midnight the tangle loosened. I slept. The morning of the review began earlier than I wanted. I woke before the alarm, lying still while the darkness thinned around the edges of the curtains. My mind moved through the day ahead as if checking locks, slides in order, figures cross-checked, explanations rehearsed. My husband stirred beside me and then settled again. I rose quietly, letting the floorboards choose which ones would complain. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee strong enough to carry me through the first hours. The air outside was cold, and when I stepped onto the porch to test it, the sharpness in my lungs brought me fully into the day. By the time I reached the office, The building's energy had shifted into that pre-meeting hum, printers busy, people adjusting their clothes as they walked, screens glowing with last-minute edits. I went straight to the conference room to connect my laptop, grateful to find it empty for a few minutes. The projector flickered once before settling into focus, the opening slide holding steady on the wall. I ran through the deck quickly, tapping the remote to be sure it responded without hesitation. Each number looked as it should, each chart told the intended story. My folder, thick with printed backups, sat on the edge of the table like insurance. Colleagues began to filter in, arranging themselves in patterns of familiarity, departments clustered, chairs turned slightly toward allies. He entered with his team, carrying a thin stack of papers and a pen clipped to his collar. Our eyes met for a fraction too long enough for me to register that he knew everything on his side was in place. We greeted each other with the same nod we would give anyone else here. It was a gesture designed to vanish into the room. The meeting opened with a summary from the director, whose voice had the practiced cadence of someone used to holding attention. When my turn came, I stood, clicked to the first slide, and began. The numbers were clean, the narrative tight, last quarter's progress, the reconciliation of previous discrepancies, the forecast ahead. I kept my tone even, my gaze moving across the room to avoid settling anywhere for too long. Questions came, as they always do, about the variance in one line, the delay in another. I answered each in turn, flipping to the relevant slide or referring to the documentation in my folder. He added a clarification at one point, supporting a figure we had worked on together. His voice was steady, unembellished, as if we were simply two parts of a larger machine functioning as intended. By the time we reached the final slide, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. Applause was brief but present, the kind that signals a job done without inviting celebration. We moved on to the next agenda item, and I returned to my seat, folding my hands in my lap. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of updates from other teams, each with its own charts and caveats. When it ended, people stood in small bursts, gathering papers and closing laptops. Conversations began forming near the door, some about the meeting, others about lunch plans. He caught my eye as I was packing up, gestured slightly toward the hallway. I followed a minute later, enough of a gap to make it unremarkable. We stopped near the side exit, a quieter stretch where foot traffic was thin. "Good work," he said simply. I thanked him and added that the alignment of our data had made the difference. That was the extent of it. We parted without ceremony, him back toward his wing, me toward my desk. The afternoon was quieter, the kind of stillness that comes after a deadline has been met. I filed the final version of the deck into the archive, sent a follow-up to the director summarizing next steps, and updated the shared drive so everyone had access to the reconciled figures. A small sense of completion threaded through my work, though it was tempered by the knowledge that another cycle would begin soon enough. When I left the building, the air had softened. The cold was still there but muted, the kind that allows you to walk without hunching. The bus ride home was uneventful, the usual mix of commuters scrolling through their phones or staring past the glass. At home, I changed into clothes that didn't announce readiness and started on dinner. The knife moved through vegetables with the efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere but whose hands knew the sequence. My husband arrived just as I was setting the table. We ate while talking about the review. I kept my description brief, focusing on the facts. He nodded in the right places, asked about the next quarter, and then shifted to his own day. After the dishes were washed and set to dry, we sat in the living room with the radio on low. A program about travel played, describing landscapes neither of us had seen. I listened more to the tone than the content, letting the voices fill the space between us. Later, he went to his desk to answer a few messages, and I took a book to bed, reading until the words blurred and my eyelids grew heavy. Sometime in the night, I woke to the faint vibration of my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit the room just enough for me to see the sender's name. The message was short, a simple acknowledgement. We spent the night together. The words sat there, stark against the dark. My pulse quickened, not from surprise, because the reality was already known, but from the sudden permanence of seeing it written. I locked the phone, placed it face down, and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, steady breath of my husband beside me. The house was silent except for that rhythm, but inside my chest, everything felt louder. I didn't sleep much after the message. The words stayed in my mind with the precision of something carved rather than written. They had no tone, no punctuation, yet they carried the weight of a statement that couldn't be softened. I lay still, listening to the familiar night sounds, the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint creak of the house as it settled, while my mind cycled through the same narrow path. By the time the alarm went off, my body felt as though it had been bracing for hours. In the kitchen, I moved through the morning routine with extra care. Coffee measured, water poured, bread in the toaster. My husband came in midway, rubbing his eyes, asking if we had milk left. I nodded and handed him the carton. The exchange was ordinary, and yet my pulse was too fast for the pace of the moment. We spoke about the day ahead, his meetings, my follow-ups from the review, and then left the apartment together, parting at the corner where our routes split. At the office, I turned on my computer and let the familiar startup sequence give me something to focus on. Emails had already begun to stack in the inbox, most of them low stakes, scheduling updates, reminders about forms, a newsletter from a department I rarely interacted with. I answered what could be answered quickly, filed away what needed more time, and left the rest for later. My plan was to keep the day full enough to leave no space for the message to resurface. But space finds its way in. At mid-morning, while checking a vendor's invoice against our records, I noticed a discrepancy that wasn't large but was persistent. I traced it back through 2 months of reports, documenting each step. The focus helped. Details are good at crowding out thought. Still, every so often, I would glance at the corner of my screen where notifications appear, half expecting another message. None came. Around noon, I went to the break room for tea. A few colleagues were gathered near the counter, laughing about something that had happened in another department. I smiled where it was polite to smile, added no comment, and waited for the kettle to boil. On the way back to my desk, I passed him in the hallway. It was brief, just a step and a nod, his eyes meeting mine for less than a second, but it was enough to register that nothing in his expression betrayed the previous night's message. That absence of reaction was deliberate. I matched it. The afternoon brought a string of small, practical demands, updating a forecast chart, confirming figures for an interdepartmental report, and reviewing a proposal draft that needed structural changes. These were the kinds of tasks that could be ticked off one by one, giving the illusion of progress. I welcomed it. At 3, I joined a short meeting about process changes, where my role was mostly to answer clarifying questions. He was there too, seated 2 chairs away, contributing in the same measured tone he always used. If anyone in the room noticed anything unusual between us, they gave no sign. By late afternoon, the sky outside the windows had turned the flat color it takes on before rain. I packed my bag deliberately, phone, charger, folder, before shutting down my computer. In the elevator, 2 people discussed dinner plans while I stared at the floor numbers, willing them to descend faster. The lobby was crowded with people leaving at the same time, coats zipped, umbrellas in hand. I joined the stream heading toward the bus stop. At home, the apartment was quiet. I changed into a sweater, set rice to cook, and began chopping vegetables. The rhythm of the knife against the board steadied my breathing. My husband came in not long after, the smell of rain on his coat. We spoke about our days in broad strokes, his progress on a project, my follow-up from the review. He mentioned a dinner with clients scheduled for later in the week. I said that would be fine. The conversation stayed in safe territory. After dinner, he settled at his desk to review some documents. I washed the dishes, dried them, and put them away. The small orderliness of the kitchen felt like something I could control. In the living room, I sat with my laptop, opening the budget file to check one last figure that had been bothering me. I corrected a misplaced entry, saved the file, and closed it. For a few moments, I stared at the blank screen's reflection, watching my own stillness. Before bed, I plugged in my phone across the room instead of keeping it on the nightstand. I told myself it was to avoid checking it in the middle of the night, though I knew it was also about creating distance from whatever might appear there. My husband read beside me for a while before turning out the light. I lay on my back, eyes open in the dark, listening to the faint sound of rain beginning again outside. The apartment felt contained, as if the walls were holding the weather at bay. When sleep came, it was shallow. I dreamed in fragments, walking through an unfamiliar office, sorting through stacks of paper, searching for a room I couldn't find. Waking before dawn, I stayed in bed until the alarm, letting the dim light filter through the curtains. I rose quietly, leaving the phone where it was, and began the next morning with the same sequence as the day before: coffee, toast, a brief exchange in the kitchen. The routine was intact. It would have to be. The day began with a thin layer of frost on the windows, the kind that outlines every edge of the glass before the heat inside pushes it back. I stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle, watching the patterns dissolve. My husband moved through the morning quietly, already dressed for an early meeting, double-checking his bag before leaving. We exchanged a brief goodbye at the door, the sort that fits into a weekday without effort. I finished my coffee in silence, letting the warmth settle before pulling on my coat. The office felt more awake than usual for the hour. Conversations overlapped in the lobby, coats draped over chairs, a smell of strong coffee drifting from the break room. I went straight to my desk and opened the updated project files. The day's work was clear: finalize the quarterly package and prepare for the client call scheduled just before noon. My focus held steady for the first hour, checking figures, rewriting a section of the summary to make it clearer, ensuring every chart matched the supporting data. I was halfway through reviewing the appendix when a message notification appeared. It was from him, a short request to confirm whether the latest numbers had been pushed to the shared drive. I typed back a single confirmation, then returned to the spreadsheet. By mid-morning, the noise in the office had shifted toward preparation for the client call. People moved between desks, gathering notes, testing headsets. I joined the meeting room early to run through my talking points. He arrived a few minutes later, nodding once as he set up. The call began on time, the client's voice filling the speaker with its usual directness. We presented the data cleanly, alternating as needed, answering questions without hesitation. His contributions were precise, technical where necessary, and always grounded in the documents. There was no trace of anything outside the scope of the call. When it ended, the client expressed satisfaction and outlined next steps. We both thanked them, logged off, and turned our attention to the rest of the day. The afternoon was occupied by smaller tasks, adjusting timelines on the project tracker, confirming delivery dates with vendors, drafting an internal note for the finance team. I kept my head down, conscious of how easily small details could unravel if left unattended. A few times, I crossed paths with him in the hallway or at the printer. Each time, the exchange was minimal, work-related, efficient, almost too deliberate in its normalcy. The absence of anything extra was its own form of communication. Around 4, the weather outside shifted. Clouds thickened, the light dimmed, and a damp chill began seeping into the building. I gathered my things earlier than usual, planning to stop at the store on the way home. As I stepped into the elevator, a group from another department joined me, carrying boxes for an off-site meeting. We stopped on the third floor, and he stepped in. For the brief ride down, we were pressed into the same small space, separated by two people between us. The doors opened to the lobby, and the group spilled out into the evening air. He glanced in my direction, but only as part of scanning the crowd. We exited through separate doors. The bus ride home was slow, caught in the start of rush hour. I sat by the window, watching the city turn on its lights one block at a time. At the store, I picked up bread, milk, and a few things for the week. The air outside carried the smell of rain that hadn't yet started. By the time I reached the apartment, my husband was already home, reading something at the kitchen table. We talked about dinner, deciding on something simple. While it cooked, he asked about my day. I gave him the outline, leaving out the details that didn't belong in the telling. After we ate, we moved to the living room. He read while I went through some personal paperwork that had been waiting on the desk. The rhythm of the evening was steady, nothing pressing against it. At one point, I reached for my phone to check a calendar reminder and saw a new message waiting. It was from him again, this time not about work. Just a single sentence, "We should talk." The words were plain, but they shifted the air in the room. I locked the screen and set the phone face down, keeping my hands on the papers in front of me. The rest of the evening passed without incident. My husband went to bed early, citing an early start the next day. I stayed up a little longer, organizing a drawer in the kitchen, folding dish towels into neat stacks. It was the kind of task that asked for just enough attention to hold other thoughts at bay. When I finally turned out the lights and went to bed, the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I lay in the dark, the message still clear in my mind. The words weren't urgent, but they weren't idle either. They belonged to a conversation that hadn't happened yet, one that would need to find its place somewhere between work and the rest of my life. Outside, the rain finally began, tapping a steady pattern against the windows. I closed my eyes and listened, knowing that tomorrow would carry its own weight. I woke before the alarm, my mind already fixed on the message from the night before. "We should talk" was still there when I reached for my phone, unsoftened by the hours between then and now. I stared at it for a moment before putting the device face down on the nightstand. My husband was still asleep, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing filling the room. I lay there longer than usual, knowing the day ahead would not follow the usual sequence, even if outwardly it appeared to. The commute passed in a blur. I couldn't recall the stops the bus made or the faces of the people around me. At the office, I went straight to my desk and buried myself in the first set of tasks. An overdue invoice needed processing. I cross-referenced the records, sent the confirmation, and ticked it off the list. The motions were familiar enough to work without conscious thought, which made them dangerous, leaving space for the conversation that hadn't yet happened to creep in around the edges. Mid-morning, I saw him at the far end of the hallway, speaking with someone from another department. When our eyes met, there was no signal, no shift, just a flicker of acknowledgement before we both looked away. A few minutes later, a calendar notification appeared, a meeting request from him, 30 minutes in one of the smaller side rooms, just before lunch. The subject line was a single word, follow-up. I clicked accept, closed the window, and returned to my work. The hours until the meeting moved slowly. I updated a set of client-facing documents, reviewed notes for the next week's planning session, and fielded a question from a colleague about last quarter's data. At one point, I walked to the kitchenette for tea and passed him in the corridor. We exchanged the same restrained greeting we always did, the kind that would sound casual if repeated aloud. It struck me that this had become our skill, how to exist in the same spaces without leaving a visible mark. When the time came, I took the folder I'd been working on with me, an extra layer of pretext if anyone asked. The side room was already occupied by him, seated at the small table with his tablet in front of him. I sat opposite, setting the folder down between us like a partition. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the building filled the gap, ventilation overhead, muted footsteps in the corridor, the faint click of a door latch somewhere nearby. He began with a single sentence, "This can't stay as it is." His tone was quiet but without hesitation. I asked what he meant, though I already knew. He said the balance we'd kept, between what was private and what was visible, was becoming untenable. It wasn't a threat, just an observation. I kept my eyes on the edge of the folder, running my finger along its seam. I told him we couldn't afford mistakes, not here, not with so much attention around us lately. He nodded once, as if he'd expected that answer, and said we needed to decide on a course that would hold. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. We agreed on boundaries, how to communicate, what to avoid, when to step back entirely. It was practical, stripped of anything that might blur the lines. When we stood, I picked up my folder, he closed his tablet, and we left the room separately. In the corridor, we moved in opposite directions, each folding back into the current of the workday. The afternoon felt heavier, as if the air in the building had thickened. I returned to my desk and pushed through a backlog of small tasks, confirming shipment dates, replying to vendor emails, updating a shared calendar. Each completed item gave me the smallest measure of control, enough to keep the hours moving. Outside, the sky darkened earlier than usual, the season tightening its grip. When I left the office, the air was damp and cool. The bus was crowded, but I found a seat near the back, pressed against the window. Streetlights blurred in the mist as the city slid past. By the time I reached my stop, the drizzle had become rain, light enough not to matter but steady enough to follow me home. My husband was already there, standing at the stove stirring a pot. He smiled when he saw me and asked about my day. I gave him the outline, busy, productive, nothing out of the ordinary. We ate dinner with the radio on low, talking about the weekend plans and whether the weather would hold. Later, while he worked in his office, I sat in the living room with a book open on my lap, reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. The rain tapped against the windows, steady and soft. My phone lay on the coffee table, dark and silent. The absence of new messages was both a relief and a reminder. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and walked to the kitchen to rinse a glass. Before bed, I checked the locks, a habit I rarely skipped. In the bedroom, my husband was already asleep, his breathing even. I lay down beside him, staring at the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dark. The day had ended without incident, but the undercurrent remained, quiet but insistent. I knew the boundaries we'd set would hold only if we both chose to keep them, and choice has a way of shifting under pressure. Outside, the rain continued, marking the hours in a language only the night fully understands.